Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aisha Rahman. Thank you so much for coming. I'm the Executive Director of KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. KARAMAH is a 21-year-old organization. We are based in Washington, D.C. We do civil and human rights. Our focus from inception has been education. So we believe firmly that there needs to be education in our community, and I've used our community very broadly on both civil rights, human rights, from an Islamic perspective, from an Islamic legal perspective, and a civil legal perspective. So today's event was put on by our Civil Rights Division. Our Civil Rights Division has also been a part of KARAMAH from the very beginning. We've had a long history of educating and listening to the community and the state of affairs for Muslim Americans. What we need to understand is that profiling, which is what we're here to talk about, or any violation of our civil rights does not exist in a vacuum. Instead, today's issues of racial and religious profiling are not really a new phenomenon. So we can go back all the way to the horrific treatment of the enslaved Africans, many of whom were Muslim, and then fast forward many years and go to the raids in 2002 against Muslim organizations and individuals, to NCERS, to NYPD spying and surveillance. And that's just a couple of things that have happened to our community in recent years. And when you look at all of that holistically, you realize that not only have the rights of the individual been impacted, but the rights of the entire community, and most importantly, the Muslim family, have been impacted. So today, we're here as a part of our Muslim American Stories initiative. Stories that I think are very powerful. The power of the narrative is very important in our community and in others. And the DOJ, Department of Education, will say to you that they haven't heard these stories. And I say that because that's what they told me. So when you talk about a young Muslim child being bullied in school, the DOE will say, well, we need to hear that story because we hear that it's happening, but we don't really know that it's happening. Okay. So I encourage all of you to share your stories today, and not only today. This town hall is just one of 4 events where we're talking about bullying, racial and religious profiling, and the immigration system, most particularly profiling and civil rights issues that are happening with our new immigration system. And simultaneous to this town hall is an online town hall where we're collecting stories. You'll see our website and our hashtag. We ask you to send in your questions, send in your stories, and also contribute to your stories either in a video or in writing to our overall initiative. And with that, I will pass it along to our moderator for the afternoon, Dr. Aziza Al-Hibri.
Assalamu alaikum. So let's get ready. Wake up, everybody. Let's get talking about this. As my colleague here said, we are very concerned about the Muslim family and the impact of this, not on you grown-ups necessarily. Yes, it will affect you, but on your children and the rest of the community. So let's work for change. Change is possible. But change does not happen if our voices are not heard. So we need to speak loudly, and we can speak through organizations and individually. So I really encourage all of you to contact KARAMAH as well as other Muslim organizations. And if you have a problem or if your child has a problem, let us know. We've already done one session about bullying in another part of the country, and today we focus on profiling. Our first speaker today is Ms. Manar Waheed, a very well-known activist and the policy director for South Asian Americans Leading Together, SALT. She's been policy director since 2012, so about 2 years now, and she engages in policy work around immigration, civil rights, and gender equity as they relate to South Asian community. And prior to working with SALT, she worked with the legal services of New York City, where she provided direct services to domestic violence survivors who were primarily from immigrant communities. Additionally, Ms. Wahid co-taught a seminar on domestic violence and legal intervention, which included the impact of media and television on violence at the Wagner College from 2009 to 2012. And she served on the board of the Muslim Bar Association of New York. She has also quite a history before coming to New York, but I think what I've said is enough to let you know that she's been immersed in the heart of the Muslim community, legally and otherwise, and we cannot wait to hear her comments. Ms. Wahid.
Thank you, and thank you so much to KARAMAH for organizing this event and to all of the co-sponsors as well. I wanted to start by backing up a little bit and just explaining the organization that I work at, which is called South Asian Americans Leading Together, or SALT. We're a national nonprofit, nonpartisan nonprofit, whose mission it is to elevate the voices of South Asian Americans in the United States. So we have a few different strategy methods that we use, from community mobilization to leadership development for youth, and then also, of course, policy analysis and advocacy, which is my area of expertise. In terms of our policy work, we work on immigration reform, civic engagement, gender justice, post 9/11 backlash, and then, of course, profiling as one of our primary issue areas. So I know that I'm coming from an organization that is South Asian, and I wanted to explain why we do so much work in the Muslim community. And part of that is because there are a lot of South Asians that are Muslim. And the other part of it is that the way that SALT really started, SALT existed before 9/11, but it was more of a leadership development organization. And then the focus really shifted on 9/11, and it became about the post 9/11 environment that South Asians were living in. And I think it's impossible to address or discuss that environment without talking specifically about the Muslim community, because it would be remiss to address any of the post 9/11 issues without looking at the Muslim community specifically. So the reason that I talk about post 9/11 is not to say that all of these issues of profiling, discrimination did not exist before, but because of the way my organization came to be. So in terms of profiling of Muslims, it happens in many different ways, as I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. But specifically, we see them most in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, and national origin. And I think all of those really apply to the Muslim community, because when people are being stereotyped, they're being stereotyped based on what they're wearing, what their skin color is, and what their general appearance is, whether that manifests in terms of what people are perceiving to be their country of origin, or what their religion is, or what their race is or ethnicity is. So as Aisha mentioned, immediately after 9/11, like a few months after 9/11, there was a program called NSEERS. It stands for National Security Exit Entry Registration System. And basically that was a program where about 25 countries were listed, all but one was predominantly Muslim, and people from those countries, males between a certain age group, had to register with the government. And as you all may be familiar with, generally, many community members' instinct is to say, I'm not doing anything wrong, I don't have anything to hide. So they go and they register with the government, and ultimately over 13,000 people were placed in deportation proceedings as a result of it. I highlight that because it is a very specific example in what happened to the Muslim community after 9/11. Since then, we've seen a series of programs, in part through our immigration system, that are things like the enforcement system. So there's a program called 287G, there's a program called Secure Communities, and what these programs do is they allow local law enforcement to engage in federal law enforcement around immigration. So they basically report to DHS through fingerprints or by checking the DHS database system. So what that does is it makes our communities really fearful when they need to call law enforcement. So if there is, and we've heard these stories in many different ways, so if a hate crime is committed, somebody might not be inclined to call their law enforcement agency because they're worried about things like their names, their family members, their neighbors, whoever it is, their fingerprints being run through the DHS system. Or if there is an incident of domestic violence, which some of the first cases after these programs started were about domestic violence survivors who were then placed in deportation proceedings. So the consequences are very serious, and the trust that is destroyed between communities and law enforcement as a result is really detrimental and makes our entire society less safe. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on before I talk about some of the stuff that's happening legislatively and legally right now is the NYPD surveillance issue. So I'm sure many of you have seen in the news, because it's been like in the New York Times and in major news outlets around the country, is the fact that the NYPD has been conducting surveillance of Muslim communities for quite some years now. It's something that I think most of our community was scared about, but we actually know for a fact over the last couple of years, based on documents that are being released, that it is happening. And that is something that it's like college kids who are engaging in their Muslim Students Association that are being watched. It's mosques that are being watched. It's local businesses that are just Muslim owned that are being watched. There was like a person who was prominent in the Muslim community whose wedding was attended by an NYPD officer undercover. There is a civil rights organization in New York City that's very prominent, that is an Arab organization, and documents were released that showed that the NYPD was trying to infiltrate their board and get somebody on their board that would report to the NYPD. And the level of just violation that occurs in our community and people's ability to practice their right to religious freedom as a result is incredible. Like, there are reports out of New York City that show what the impact on the Muslim community is, and people's like fear around, like, we're talking about college students who are like trying to figure out who they are and find their community as they're growing up, and they can't go to their MSA to engage because they're afraid they're going to be watched by the government, not because they're doing anything wrong, but because nobody wants to be watched. So I think it really changes the climate and some of our really basic constitutional rights. And it really threatens all of our civil rights as Americans, whether you're Muslim or not. The thing about profiling is that, so there's the piece that's the violation of our civil rights, and then there's also the piece that is the destruction of community relationships that I was talking about, and a violation, and makes it impossible for us to be as safe as we can as a society. If I can't call 911 because I don't trust law enforcement, there are crimes being committed and I can't report them because I'm scared of law enforcement. And I think the last thing about that also is that it completely wastes our government resources. Studies have shown over and over again, we've seen this through stop and frisk for so many years. Profiling doesn't work. It's not effective. We have like law enforcement sitting in on like soccer games in New York City that are Muslim community soccer games. When we have people who have like what is called in the criminal system an individualized assessment of danger, and they're not using those assessments as much because they're putting all their resources towards this surveillance that's completely just based on stereotypes and that doesn't prove anything, that doesn't yield any results. And one of the examples, well, two of the examples around that is that program I was talking about called NCERS, where over 13,000 individuals were placed in deportation. There was not one terrorism-related charge that came out of that. The NYPD surveillance that's been going on for years, they have like a whole map of where the Muslim communities are and who they're watching, not one terrorism-related charge. And these are all of our government resources that are being wasted to no end while crimes are actually being committed. The last thing I want to do, and I won't do it for very long because I think it's boring for a lot of people, is kind of talk about what the legislative issues are that are going on right now. So there's something called the DOJ guidance. That's what it's commonly called, but it's a guidance to end profiling by federal law enforcement. It was created in 2003. It's an Ashcroft guidance. And basically, it prohibits profiling based on race and ethnicity. So it very deliberately leaves out national origin and religion, which very drastically impacts our communities, and which is how and where we've seen a lot of profiling post 9/11. It also has like a really large border and national security loophole, which basically means, like, we've all heard, I'm sure many of you have heard the term national security thrown around all the time, and it becomes an exception that is so big that there is no rule to prohibit profiling, in my opinion. There are also like some other changes that SALT and like many other groups have been advocating for a very long time now. We're talking about well over a decade. And that's to have a piece in there that is an enforcement piece so that when federal law enforcement does profile, there are ways to hold them accountable. Because if we can't hold them accountable, nobody's going to follow the rules because there's no repercussions. Also, we would like to see something in there that includes activities by state and local law enforcement that are either receiving federal funds or enforcing federal laws. So that would encompass some of the NYPD surveillance stuff as well. And then lastly, to have a piece around prohibiting data collection based on profiling, because we have all of this data and mapping that the NYPD is holding as a result of all of their profiling. So this is something it's been about 11 years that advocacy groups have been fighting this. There's been some movement in the last couple of months, but that movement takes the shape of media. So the New York Times got some leaked documents and put some stuff out saying the DOJ is going to revise their guidance. We've been hearing for a very long time, like years and years, that the DOJ is going to revise their guidance, but we see no movement on it. We think that this is going to be the year for that because of the documents that are being leaked and because it's now the DOJ that is involved. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, is also involved. So a lot of groups are pushing from many different angles to try to make this happen in the near future. But I think part of what we're trying to do and part of what we've been asked to do by other advocacy groups as well as government is to raise the profile of profiling, to raise the issue, whether it's by telling your story or whether it's by talking about this guidance or what the ways are that it impacts our communities, because members of Congress, the DOJ, DHS, they're not seeing the pressure from the public. And what we've seen with immigration reform, though we are at a halt right now, is that part of why that movement took off after the last election was because of the power of the voters. And if people don't feel like the people of the U.S. want to see these changes, they're not priorities. The other piece of law that's currently out there, so the DOJ guidance it's like a rule. It's not technically law, but we want to see that fixed. But the piece of law that's out there that's been floating out there since it'll be 13 years this week, actually, is called IRPA. It's the End Racial Profiling Act. So this is an act that would prohibit profiling based on race, ethnicity, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender. Basically, this is a law that's been written by all of our friends. This is a law that's been written by advocacy groups. It's been written by members of Congress that really believe in these issues. And it would have measures of accountability. It would have ways of monitoring the issue. It would have basically the bill that's out there that's been proposed in the House and the Senate is everything we could ask for. But it's been introduced and reintroduced and reintroduced, and it hasn't taken off. And I truly believe that it hasn't taken off because there are people that are afraid of what will happen when they're not allowed to profile. I think there are people in government that really believe that profiling works and aren't looking at the data, aren't seeing public outcry, and so it's not a priority to them. And so that's another piece of the work, is kind of like pushing that forward as well, whether through your districts or whether just like by having events and talking about the issue and raising public awareness, raising awareness in the media, like local newspapers, whatever it is, because it actually has incredible impact. And the last piece, since I've been such a downer, that I wanted to talk about was that there's like actually something good that happened this week that I wanted to highlight. So there was a bill in Congress this week that's on appropriations, so it was basically budget stuff. And Keith Ellison proposed an amendment that prohibited profiling so it basically ties it to money. So no profiling against all of the categories that I basically listed, or you don't receive federal funds for certain things. And it passed. It passed on Friday. So I think that's just like an example of sometimes these things happen under the radar because that's how we get less pushback, and sometimes they happen because of like a public push and public outcry. And right now, there is kind of this momentum around this issue of profiling and ending it with through the DOJ guidance, through the New York Times articles, through the fact that members of Congress have been submitting letters to the Attorney General asking them to change this guidance with all of the points that the advocates are asking for. And so they're finding ways and places to put it through legislation, even though it's not the exact legislation that we want. And so I just wanted to share that little piece of success as well, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Manar, for that very important update and history of profiling. Our next speaker is somebody you're all familiar with, Kamran Mamoun, who is a Chicago attorney and the president of Muslims for a Safe America. And as an attorney, Mr. Memon has worked for clients who have been fired, denied jobs, or denied promotions because of their race, gender, national origin, or religion. He has also represented clients who have been fired or denied jobs because they wanted to wear religious clothing items at work, because they wanted time off to attend prayer services, and because they wanted to wear beards or dreadlocks for religious reasons, and clients who have been sexually harassed, sexual comments or sexual touching by their bosses, and then punished when they complained. Mr. Memon is also the president of Muslims for Safe America, an organization that teaches American Muslims about 3 areas relating to national security: religion and identity, civil liberties, domestic security, and foreign policy through mock debates. And he is a graduate of this university, so welcome, come on over.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, KARAMAH. I have a lot to say, so I expect that Professor Al-Hibri will grab me by the collar and throw me to the side as soon as my time is done. Manar talked about examples of profiling and about how profiling hurts innocent Americans and the country. I'd like to talk about why government officials have singled out the American Muslim community for surveillance, searches, infiltration, and other negative attention. And I'd like to talk about why so many Americans support profiling us, and about whether there's anything we can do to change their minds. Polls show that most Americans seem to be okay with our community in general, but a significant minority of Americans don't like us, and they're suspicious of us. And as long as they continue to dislike us and continue to be suspicious of us, they will continue to support profiling. However, even some of the Americans who seem to be okay with our community in general still support profiling because they are concerned about their security. If we understand the concerns of various Americans, perhaps we can find a way to address those concerns and reduce profiling. So let's look at the numbers. According to a 2009 Gallup report, 9% of Americans said, and this was about 5 years back, and I have not seen newer numbers, but I think it's fair to rely on these numbers for purposes of our conversation, because I don't think that much has changed. 9% of Americans said that they had a great deal of prejudice against us. 20% said they had some prejudice against us. 14% said they had a little bit of prejudice against us. And 57%, a majority, said that they had no prejudice. So 43% of Americans admit to feeling at least some prejudice towards Muslims. So we start with that strike against us in the minds of almost half of the country. According to that same Gallup report, Americans dislike the Islamic religion even more than they dislike us as Muslims. 53% of Americans said that they had an unfavorable opinion of Islam. According to that report, 70% of Americans said that they believed that Muslims wanted peace, but 27% disagreed. Another poll, a 2010 Time magazine poll, found that Americans had the following views of Islam: very unfavorable, 21%; somewhat unfavorable, 22%; somewhat favorable, 32%; and very favorable, 12%. When Time magazine asked if Islam is more likely than other religions to encourage violence against non-believers, less likely or about the same as most other religions, 46% of Americans said that Islam was more likely to encourage violence against non-believers than other religions. 6% said less likely, 39% said same as other religions. When Time asked if Muslims in the United States are patriotic Americans who believe in American values or not, most Americans said that they think we are patriotic, 55%. 25%, which is still a significant chunk, said they believe we are not patriotic. A 2010 Economist magazine poll found that Americans had the following views of Islam: very unfavorable, 27.7%. Somewhat unfavorable, 27.7%, same number. Very favorable, 4.1%, and somewhat favorable, 16.4%. According to a 2011 Gallup report, which asked respondents to identify their religious beliefs, 56% of Protestants, 63% of Catholics, 70% of Jews, 57% of Mormons, and 75% of non-religious people believe that we do not sympathize with Al-Qaeda. Those are significant numbers. Those are majority numbers. But significant minorities of Americans believe that we sympathize with Al-Qaeda. According to that 2011 Gallup report, 80% of Jews, 59% of Catholics, 56% of Protestants, 56% of Mormons, and 69% of non-religious Americans say that they believe we are loyal to America. So again, that's a majority, but that still leaves a significant minority doubting our loyalty to this country. Now, this raises an interesting question, because these numbers show that the majority of Americans are reasonably okay with us. If only a minority of Americans are suspicious of us, why is there strong political support for profiling? Now, here are some numbers on profiling. According to Gallup's 2011 report, and this touches on an issue that comes up often, 81% of American Muslims say that terrorist profiling does not work, waste of time, ineffective. 17% of Muslim Americans say it is possible to effectively profile a terrorist. Now, Americans of other faiths are more likely to believe that terrorist profiling works. 55% of Protestants, 54% of Catholics, 58% of Mormons, and 49% of Jews say it is possible to effectively profile a terrorist. And Gallup also asked a slightly different question. According to that same report, 6% of Muslim Americans believe it is possible to profile a terrorist and that law enforcement should watch individuals fitting the profile more closely. Between 35% to 40% of the others, Protestants, Catholics, Mormons, and Jews, believe it is possible to profile a terrorist and that law enforcement should do it. A 2010 Gallup poll found that 71% of Americans favor more intensive security checks for airline passengers on the basis of age, ethnicity, and gender. In other words, young Muslim males. A 2013 Gallup poll found that 11% of Americans are very worried that they or members of their family will be victims of terrorist attacks. 29% are somewhat worried, 33% are not too worried, and 27% are not worried at all. And I'm almost done with the numbers. 2014 Gallup poll found that 39% of Americans worry a great deal about the possibility of future terrorist attacks in America. 24% worry a fair amount, 26% worry only a little, and 11% don't worry at all. And finally, a 2013 Gallup poll found that 12% of Americans think that it is very likely that there will be terrorist attacks in the US over the next several weeks. Again, that was asked a year ago. 39% said it was somewhat likely that there would be terrorist attacks in the US over the next several weeks. 34% said it was not too likely, and 12% said it was not likely at all. Now, where does the suspicion and fear of us come from? For one thing, Al-Qaeda cited a combination of religious and political motivations for the 9/11 attacks. Since then, several American Muslims have expressed a combination of religious and political motivations for attacking the United States. I'll mention just a few high-profile examples so that we can keep in mind what it is that is scaring people. In November 2009, an American Muslim soldier stationed at Fort Hood in Texas, Major Nadal Malik Hassan, was accused of shooting and killing 12 American soldiers and wounding many others. Witnesses say he shouted, "Allahu Akbar," or "God is great," before opening fire. In June 2010, an American Muslim from Connecticut, Faisal Shahzad, pled guilty to attempting to set off a car bomb in New York City's Times Square. When the judge asked Shahzad for an explanation, he said, quote, "It's a war. I am part of the answer to the U.S. terrorizing the Muslim nations and the Muslim people. And he told the judge he was, quote unquote, a Muslim soldier. In April 2013, we all know about we all remember the Boston Marathon bombings. The government alleged that while Jahar Tsarnaev was hiding before his arrest, he wrote the following messages: "The U.S. government is killing our innocent civilians. I can't stand to see such evil go unpunished. And we Muslims are one body. You hurt one, you hurt us all." Now, of course, the other side of the Tsarnaev story is that before the bombing, Tsarnaev's brother, Tamerlan, had been kicked out of a local mosque because of his extreme views. Nonetheless, all of these American Muslims, Nidal Hassan, Faisal Shahzad, the Tsarnaevs, blended into American society. Their neighbors thought they were ordinary people who posed no threat to Americans until they launched their attacks. And Americans keep hearing about these types of incidents in the news. Professor, do you know how I'm doing on time? Oh, 5 minutes? Okay. Okay. No, I know, but I saw her monitoring, so thank you. And Americans keep hearing about these types of incidents in the news. A trial began in Tampa, Florida this past week where some of these same issues came up. Now, until recently, Americans tended to think that these kinds of terrorist attacks inside the United States were monopolized by Muslims. Recently, however, there has been somewhat of an increase in public awareness of attacks and killings by American right-wing extremists. In April 2014, Peter Bergen of CNN reported that since 9/11, extremists affiliated with a variety of right-wing ideologies, including white supremacists, anti-abortion extremists, and anti-government militants, 4 minutes, okay, have killed more people in the United States than have extremists motivated by Al-Qaeda's ideology. According to a count by the New America Foundation, right-wing extremists have killed 34 people in the US for political reasons since 9/11, including Fraser Glenn Cross's murders of 3 Jews at Jewish sites in Kansas City in April 2014, and Wade Michael Page's murders of 6 people in a shooting at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin in August 2012. By contrast, terrorists motivated by Al-Qaeda's ideology have killed 21 people in the US since 9/11, so that's 34 versus 21. Moreover, since 9/11, none of the more than 200 individuals indicted or convicted in the US of some act of jihadist terrorism, none of them have acquired or used chemical or biological weapons or their precursor materials, while 13 individuals motivated by right-wing ideology, 1 individual motivated by left-wing ideology, and 2 with idiosyncratic beliefs used or acquired chemical or biological weapons or their precursor materials. The Southern Poverty Law Center reports an example of a right-wing plot to use chemical weapons. In 2003, William Krar of Texas pled guilty to possession of a chemical weapon. Krar had more than 500,000 rounds of ammunition, 65 pipe bombs, and remote control briefcase bombs, and almost 2 pounds of deadly sodium cyanide. Also found were components to convert the cyanide into a bomb capable of killing thousands, along with white supremacist and anti-governmental material. Now, this is what Peter Bergen of CNN says, quoting, "Despite this history of deadly violence by individuals motivated by political ideologies other than Al-Qaeda, it is jihadist violence that continues to dominate the news and the attention of policymakers. Some of this is quite understandable." He talks about 9/11, 3,000 people died, talks about other Al-Qaeda plots. He says, "Luckily, these plots didn't succeed, but certainly if they had, the death toll would have been on a large scale. Yet, the disparity in media coverage between even failed jihadist terrorist attacks and this latest incident in Kansas, the murder of 3 Jews, is emblematic of a flawed division in the public's mind between killing that is purportedly committed in the name of Allah and killing that is committed for other political ends, such as neo-Nazi beliefs about the need to kill Jews. Part of the reason for this disconnect, this is still Bergen, part of the reason for this disconnect might be that when a Department of Homeland Security report warning of violent right-wing extremism was leaked in 2009, it generated a substantial political controversy. In a 2011 interview with the Southern Poverty Law Center, Darrell Johnson, the lead of the team that produced the report, the 2009 report about right-wing extremism, argued that following the controversy, following the release of that report about right-wing extremism, DHS's examination of such threats suffered, stating, quote, "Since our report was leaked, DHS has not released a single report of its own on this topic, not anything dealing with non-Islamic domestic extremism, whether it's anti-abortion extremists, white supremacists, sovereign citizens, eco-terrorists, the whole gamut," close quote. What Bergen is saying, and I'll end with this, is that there is political pressure on the government to minimize discussion about other threats, like right-wing terrorism. As a result, when Americans hear about right-wing violence, they think about it in terms of isolated incidents that can be safely forgotten, unlike their thoughts of the jihadist threat to America, which they view as part of a bigger movement. Thank you.
Just in time. This is amazing. Our two speakers have given us quite a bit of food for thought. So I'm hoping that you're working this along as we listen to our last speaker. I myself have come up with a lot of questions, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions when they're done. It's true that we are lecturing now to you, we're giving you our views, but this is supposed to be interactive. We're here together to try and figure out how we could do things better so that the situation will improve. So please think along these lines as I introduce our last and honored speaker, Ami Gandhi. Ms. Gandhi is Executive Director for the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, which is, the acronym is SAPRI, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization which is established in 2001 to improve the lives of South Asian Americans in the Chicago area by using research to formulate equitable and socially responsible public policy recommendations. SAPRI's work has included initiatives on civic engagement, language access, healthcare, immigration, and prevention of hate crimes and violence. Following the 2012 Oak Creek tragedy, many of you are familiar with here, and the violent attacks on local Muslim institutions, SAPRI helped pass resolutions in Chicago and Illinois denouncing the hate crimes and rhetoric and promoting education and dialogue on diverse cultures and religions. Ms. Gandhi is an attorney who is passionate about advocating for minority and immigrant communities. I should mention that she serves on the Advisory Council for the City of Chicago's Office of New Americans and the Task Force on Opportunities for DREAM Act students at University of Illinois at Chicago, and she was also nominated for various human rights awards. Ms. Gandhi, we're happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I've learned so much from the other speakers as well as from many of you in this room and other trusted colleagues and coalition partners in Chicago, especially due to recent events that I'll be talking about that have affected our communities here locally, even in very recent days. And so I'm going to do something a little bit different with the speaking time, if you'll please bear with me. I'm actually going to read you a statement from my phone, which is not something I would normally do, but it's just so important that we do that in a time like this when many of our communities are vulnerable, especially in our interactions with law enforcement. And I want you to be hearing some of the actual words that have come from law enforcement here in Chicago that have left many of our communities feeling concerned. And you know, the reason I want to do that is because right now it is an incredible opportunity to form broader coalitions as we try to tackle complex issues like profiling, like surveillance, and abuses of power by law enforcement. And one of the reasons it's such a good opportunity for that work, especially here in Chicago, speaking from the perspective of an organization that's based here, the reason it's a good opportunity is because it's a bad time. It's a bad time for various communities of color, immigrant and minority communities, because of our interactions with law enforcement. So I want to share with you a statement that SAPRI issued just very recently in recent days in partnership with other Asian American organizations. Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, the Japanese American Citizens League, and SAPRI are appalled by the treatment of Jian Jessica Kleizek by Chicago police officers. According to a lawsuit very recently filed in federal court, during a raid of Ms. Kleizek's business in 2013, Chicago police officers verbally and physically abused Ms. Kleizek with racist taunts and unnecessary force. The incident was captured by a surveillance camera. In the video footage available on the website of Chicago Sun-Times, a Chicago police officer can be seen striking Ms. Kleizek on the back of the head after she is handcuffed, subdued, and kneeling on the ground. Another officer is heard to shout at Ms. Kleizek that she is not effing American and threatens to, quote, put her in a UPS box and send her back to wherever the F she came from. Ms. Kleizek, a United States citizen, protested to the officers that she is a citizen. The response from the officer was, no, you're not. You're not a citizen. You're not. You're here on our borrowed time. So mind your effing business before I shut this whole effing place down. And I'll take this place, and whoever owns it will effing kill you because they don't care about you, okay? I'll take this building, you'll be dead, and your family will be dead. The Asian American community is well acquainted with the slander shouted by the officer who arbitrarily denied Ms. Kleizek's claim that she was a citizen. It's a stereotype that continues to marginalize Asian Americans by perpetuating the myth that all Asians are foreigners. This myth was reinforced by the officer's unwarranted, unauthorized, and unacceptable threat of deportation. And our organizations are aware that this case is in litigation and all parties certainly deserve their due process rights. However, the outrageous and disgraceful behavior and statements in the video footage, purportedly by members of the Chicago Police Department, who are sworn to serve and protect all members of our society, must not be tolerated regardless of a crime suspect's actual or perceived race, national origin, immigration status, or level of English proficiency. And just a side note, I would add religion to that as well. When law enforcement officials abuse their power to intimidate, harass, assault, and stereotype, the harm goes far beyond hurting the feelings of minority and immigrant communities. Abuse of power by law enforcement threatens our entire city's safety and security by undermining our community's trust and cooperation with the police. A spokesperson for the police has said that the alleged comments are reprehensible and intolerable. Our organizations demand that concrete steps be taken by the Chicago Police Department and the City of Chicago to train law enforcement and other city personnel about the lack of tolerance for such conduct. So there's been a growing movement, even in the last several days, by diverse communities who are affected by their problematic interactions with law enforcement towards the goal of how can we keep all of our communities more safe and secure, including people who are suspected of a crime. And there is going to be a broad cross-racial effort to speak with Chicago Police Department, to speak to others in power across different racial and religious groups. And there is a town hall taking place that's hosted by Asian Americans Advancing Justice that will take place on Saturday, this coming Saturday, June 7th in the afternoon on the north side of Chicago. And please see me later if any of you are interested in joining this effort. And SAPRI will certainly post more information about this to our website and online as well. Because it brings to question how much do our diverse communities want to band together in the face of, and I know we're convened here today to talk about profiling, and it's extremely important for us to address that. And I thank you for allowing me to veer off the topic a little bit. But how can we talk about some of these systemic underlying issues that are leading to profiling in some instances, to police brutality in other instances, and overall possibly misunderstanding or mistreatment of our diverse communities? So one thing, I wanted to share with you those few reflections that we had, especially in recent days. And I also want to ask a few questions. So I'd like to use my time that way as well. I know it's a little bit of a lame thing for me to do, to ask questions instead of answering them. But I hope that it creates some constructive dialogue among all of our groups and all of the great leaders in the room today. So one question that has come to mind for SAPRI and the work that we do in the local South Asian community, and that's been on the minds of others as well in these challenging times, is how widespread do we want our anti-profiling work to be when we're trying to pursue change, as other panelists have mentioned? How much do we want to build alliances with other communities? And I don't mean that as a rhetorical question. I don't mean to be preachy about it and say that we absolutely have to align with every group out there who's concerned about social problems or violence. But it's something I really want people to think about, because it's been on our minds, and it's something that SAPRI is taking very seriously. When we, some of the groups that work on these issues in Chicago, that some of which, to be totally honest, I'm just starting to learn about, and SAPRI is just starting to learn about. Some of these organizations, I wanted to share with you their names because some of you may be interested in engaging with them more on their work. Project NIA, that's spelled NIA, CARE Chicago, that many of you are familiar with, Asian Americans Against Police Brutality, Advancing Justice Chicago that I mentioned, the Transformative Justice Law Project of Illinois, Illinois Caucus for Adolescent Health, and many others. And it's something that we want to consider when we want to persuasively explain to really diverse audiences why surveillance is problematic, why profiling is problematic. Are we also comfortable saying, and again, I don't mean this as a rhetorical question, it's something for us all to reflect on. Are we comfortable saying that police brutality is wrong against people who are sex workers or stereotyped as sex workers? Is that something that our communities want to take a stand on when we're looking for diverse allies to support us in raising the visibility of problematic practices like profiling? We want to consider if we would be interested in partnering with groups like the ones that I mentioned. And some of these, I wanted to thank activists Steve Moon and Nebula Lee, who have been really helpful in educating SAPRI and others in the community as we've been exploring these, admittedly very complex issues. And I want to pose another question as I finish, and it's about a different type of alliance and coalition building. So there may be some alliances that we're very comfortable entering into, like the groups represented here that are co-hosting today's event. And it's really inspiring that we can achieve more when we're in solidarity together and coming together for an event and discussion like this, rather than us duplicating work or trying to do too much separately and not accomplishing as much as we could together. We also want to think about who are the potential allies. Other speakers also talked about how can we do a better job with building bridges of other people who are not like us. And that's some of what SAPRI tries to do among the South Asian community that, of course, all of you know is very diverse in terms of language and religion and country of origin. And so a question that I pose to all of you is, how much do we want to engage in answering questions and having discussions with potential allies, even if some of those questions and discussions start from a place of ignorance or misunderstanding? I think we've all probably come across that in our lives and in our work at one level or another. And it's something that we have been grappling with right here in Chicago. So for example, one of our partners, probably an organization known to many of you in this room called Silk Road Rising. It's an amazing theater organization based right here in Chicago. And they had a play in the last year or two called Invasion. And it was an artistic representation of the very personal, emotional effects of profiling on an immigrant and on someone whose immigration status may leave that person vulnerable. And when profiling is happening on top of that, what happens to that individual and his family. And, I'm not an art critic or an expert. I won't pretend to be one. But I, along with many other community individuals and organizations, were appalled when we saw a Sun-Times review of the play that said, and I'll read this for you, despite the passion of the play, this is what the theater critic from Chicago Sun-Times wrote, those still thinking of the horrific terrorist attacks at the Boston Marathon might be tempted to ask, what practical alternative to profiling would you suggest? And that was something that many of us found to be outrageous and irresponsible to be published in an arts review in such a prominent paper. On the other hand, if we hear those questions at our dinner tables or in our religious institutions, or when we're speaking with family or friends, sometimes I reflect on maybe I shouldn't feel frustrated by a question like that, and it should be an opportunity for dialogue. So hopefully there can be some education and progress or learning happening both ways. It's something that Silk Road Rising took the opportunity to write a nice piece about it, which is online, saying perhaps the Sun-Times should have asked African Americans if they could suggest any practical alternatives to profiling. Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans. What about the 125,000 Japanese Americans who were shipped off to internment camps because no one suggested a practical alternative to profiling? And Silk Road Rising went on to say perhaps the newspaper writer was thinking, too bad for them, it didn't affect me. So I think we all navigate conversations like that if we're really being honest, and if people around us really feel comfortable being honest with us. And it comes up in the South Asian American community too. Coming from a family that's Hindu and Jain, we even get questions about what Muslims stand for and what Muslims stand against. And it's not something for me to answer or for Sapri to answer, but these kinds of conversations come up in the community. So when we're thinking about allies, when we're thinking about how broad we want our movements to be to hopefully combat the problematic practice of profiling, it also may mean opening the door to some tough conversations, and we as organizations and activists have to think about how comfortable we are navigating those and what may be the appropriate forum for discussion so it can be constructive as opposed to a one-way conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You agree with me that was quite a range of comments on the topic, and I thank you all again for your contributions. In listening to the speakers, I have a few comments I want to share with you and then ask questions. If you don't mind, I'll share my thoughts first. I'm thinking about what Mr. Memon said, that recently we're starting to have right-wing terrorist attacks who are being called terrorist attacks. And I'm thinking, that's true. That's because earlier ones were not called terrorist attacks. Oklahoma, for example, predates a lot of events, was seen as one quirky guy. There are many others, and even the anti-abortion activities. And that leads to the question of who names what. And in society, it's important for us to know who does the naming. Because the person or the party that does the naming has the power. And the party that's being named is the powerless. And we, Muslims, blacks, Southeast Asians, whatever, are being named. We don't get to name. And so we're being named terrorist when people choose to name us terrorist. And we're being named, some of us, good Americans, when people want to showcase certain examples, but we have no power over that. That needs to change. We have to be able to name in this society like everybody else, not only ourselves, but others. I know that a great deal of fear governs minority societies like the Muslims in this country. Where does this fear come from? We mentioned that it is their immigrant status in part. That's not enough. That's not alone it. The problem with the Muslim community is that for a long time, they did not get into law. Right, Kamran?
Right.
You are probably the next generation after me. And I remember when I came to Chicago, when you were still not a lawyer, I was speaking in mosques and asking the audience to please sacrifice one of their children to the law. Because everybody wants to be a doctor, right? Nothing wrong with doctors. But when there is a civil rights problem, who do you turn to? A doctor or a lawyer? And now we're starting to get into this. But the upshot of this is that our legal rights and our legal consciousness in this country are not that deep. We still don't know what we can do or cannot do. And so fear governs the behavior of the Muslim immigrant. And there are many ways to really deal with that, including the alliances that you mentioned with more experienced groups like the Japanese and the African Americans, right? I mean, who could be more experienced? So this is one of the issues that we are facing in our community. We really need to educate about develop legal consciousness. That's part of what KARAMAH wants to do. And if you have ideas about how we could help in that, we are more than happy to devote our resources to help in that. Now, some of you and some of our audience online might think that, but there are many organizations that do case-by-case support in case of discrimination. This is wonderful. It used to be that a Muslim would be discriminated against and nothing happens. Now, there are cases in the court. But we really need more than that. We do not need a case-by-case approach. Muslims need to understand what each one case followed by another means. In other words, we need to move from the tactical behavior of going to court on each case to a strategic plan of how do you fight discrimination, how do you fight this kind of behavior, which is denying you your constitutional rights. What's the meaning of this citizenship if it does not mean that you are protected by the Constitution? I think we need to make this idea deeper into the Muslim consciousness. Kamran, you mentioned that thankfully all the negative stereotypes of Muslims in the population are still in the minority. For example, one that struck me was the statistic about who's afraid of another terrorist attack, another September 11. Still a minority, right? However, I bet you anything that a big part of the minority is us Muslims. We're the ones worried about a next terrorist attack that is going to be attributed to us, over which we have no control, because we are as concerned about the safety of this country as anybody else, and it's not being recognized. We're being all put together in one profile, very negative profile. And is it because of September 11? No. I'm old enough to know that it started way before 9/11. And given what has been happening for decades now, way before 9/11 and after 9/11, it's almost a miracle that there is only a minority of Americans that thinks negatively about us. And that's not thanks to our activities of trying to stand up for our religion or stand up for our co-citizens and for ourselves. And that behavior needs to change. If nothing else comes out of this meeting, I hope that we think together of ways of how do we change this. And if there's anything that KARAMAH could do in Chicago or anywhere else, for those listening online, we are happy to do it. But you guys are Americans with constitutional rights, and you cannot be fully invested in this country unless you believe that. You cannot be a really productive citizen of this country unless you believe that. And we believe it. We at KARAMAH believe it. And we're ready to put our hands, not only in your hands, but in your hands, and in the hands of all the other people who are suffering this kind of stereotyping and discrimination and profiling, because nobody on this continent, nobody in the US should be suffering from it. It's time to end this. Together, we minorities are the majority in this country, and our voice should be heard. Where are our voices? Let's make them heard. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about this, and I'm ready to take any questions you might have. Let's see, who's going to be the first here? Yes, sir.
Great presentations by all of you. Thank you so much.
Do we
KARAMAH.
pass the microphone? Because it's being taped, so.
I have 2 teenager kids, so I can yell across the room without the mic. So once again, thanks for great presentations by all of you. 2 quick questions, unrelated, but they both pertain to this discussion. What is the government to do as far as Muslim terrorist acts are concerned, or acts originated by Muslims or in Muslim countries, so on and so forth, without profiling? Second question, both Manar and Kamran talked about employment discrimination. There's another level of employment discrimination that, as far as I know, doesn't get talked about, and that's also at the highest levels of employment in this country. Very specifically and very personally, Kamran knows this, I was turned down for an interview request at the business school by a major investment bank saying they cannot interview me because I was not born in this country. My resume clearly says U.S. citizen at the bottom. And being not born in this country is not an impediment, don't need to tell you. Then another hedge fund in Chicago interviewed me and asked me if I'm a practicing Muslim, the names of my kids, if they go to an Islamic school. I was chief compliance officer of an investment firm at the time, and I told them that these are all legal questions. They said, no, they have been cleared by our legal eagles. Kamran was ready to take on both of these firms, but I had too many other things going on in my life. So there's this level of employment discrimination that goes on unreported because we are just too busy with other things in our lives and we let it go. But after many years, I have come to realize that my examples are not isolated ones necessarily. So your comment on any of this,
Who would
please.
like to answer? Would you want to?
Sure, I'll go first. So I think on the first question, so I would disagree that we have a Muslim terrorist issue. I don't think this is about a religion. I think it's about individuals, and I think that is a problem that has been perpetuated through the media. When we have someone that commits a shooting like the one we saw in California recently, it's a mental health issue. We don't get a description of race or religion unless the person is a person of color or the religion is usually Islam, right? Otherwise, we don't even get that reporting because there's a mental health issue, there's an issue of whatever it is, but it's not under that veil. And I don't think this is not about a religion, this is not about a race, this is not about a country of origin, this is about individuals and individuals with a propensity to commit crime, which is why I would go back to the idea of individualized assessments by law enforcement, not religion-based stereotyping or ethnicity-based stereotyping or race-based stereotyping. I don't think it's effective, and I don't think that it will solve any issues that we see. And like I said, with the pieces of profiling that are policies, like the NYPD, like NCERS, those things, they haven't proven to be effective. They haven't caught anyone that way. And meanwhile, we have acts of what are often not labeled as terrorism. We have acts of shootings that are not labeled as terrorism because of who is committing the crime and what they look like. And I think that's a much broader problem. And what we see happen with these issues is this is like a chicken and egg issue, but like it's a very cyclical problem. But we have certain government policies that profile, that stereotype certain communities, that create the image of these communities as dangerous or suspicious. That perpetuates through our society. We see it in law enforcement trainings. We've seen trainings around the country that like villainify Muslims or make them be seen as dangerous. We see the stop and frisk policies, and law enforcement is trained on that. So we have policies from like law enforcement to immigration enforcement to whatever it is, and then we have government officials, politicians making statements of xenophobic rhetoric, and it perpetuates, and then we see it fall in the media, then we see hate crimes. We see all of these things go unaccounted for, and I'm not saying one causes the other, I'm saying the cumulative effects of all of this is a climate in which all of these things are permissible because we're not doing anything about them, and they just continue to create this pattern. And it's not just about Muslims, it's about everyone. It's whatever that community is in the moment that is being villainified. So whether it's Japanese Americans in the past, whether it's Black Americans, that has historically pretty much always been, it's a different community, and I think that is xenophobia based. That's not about just Islamophobia. It's much, much broader than that.
Rizwan, I think you asked a valid question because many Americans are scared of Muslims and of the possibility of violence by Muslims. And one reason for that is that there have been a number of Muslims who have engaged in attacks or plotted attacks and given religious justifications or a mixture of religious and political justifications, which work together in their thinking. And so, from my perspective, we do have to offer alternatives to American society. It's not enough for us to say there's no threat there's no religiously motivated threat from Muslims, because it's undisputed that a very tiny number of Muslims have engaged in such activity. But that activity has an effect beyond their numbers. 9/11 was 19 people, 19 hijackers, but the death toll was almost 3,000, and the impact on the U.S. has been way beyond 19 people.
Did you know that most Americans fear not the 19 people or Nadal or Faisal Shahzad of the world?
Can you get the mic? Can you get the mic?
The ideology behind it. It's not the 19 people that most Americans fear, it's the ideology behind it. So not those individual loan sharks, but the ideology behind it that's fearful.
You know, if I may intercept at this point a comment, it's not the ideology behind it, but the ignorance and fear of what might be lurking behind it. And the reason for this, I'll give you an example. When anti-abortionists attack clinics and destroy them or kill somebody, we don't immediately fear Christians. You know why? Because we know who Christians are. We're in a Christian country. We don't think that Christianity is a violent religion. We don't have any of those stereotypes. Where do we get the stereotypes? In cases where we do not know what this religion or this ideology means. And what this says is that we have to speak out, just like Manar said. We're not a secret. Islam is a religion of 1.5 billion people around the world. Had we been violent, the whole earth would be on fire now, right? So all we need is to talk about religion, our religion, in a proud way, not in an apologetic way. And by the way, we are not violent. We should not be assumed to be violent. In 1.5 billion, if there are 19 people who are violent, well, you know, that's really very good odds, you know, for any kind of group worldwide or in this nation. That is not to say that we should not guard against these kinds of horrible attacks. But then the profile would not be, well, let's figure out who is Muslim on this plane and search them or whatever. The profile should be, let's figure out who's inclined towards violence on mass scale, and let's figure out what we can do about them. That is not happening. When you ask the wrong question, you answer it with the wrong answer, and that is what's happening in our situation. Other questions? Yes, sir. And identify
hold on
yourself.
1 second. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Kamran Aslam, so hopefully you're not confused, not the speaker. I just had a follow-up comment on that and question, and just wanted to carry on the process of conversation. So hopefully you can maybe comment on this a little bit. One thing that occurred to me while Manar was speaking, and as well as everybody else, and I think taking from Kamran Mamon's style or the way of speaking, he really addressed why are they afraid of us. So it's trying to understand the other side and then try to understand the other side so you can actually address the problem, right? There's some people that are identifying the problem, and then you have to understand where that problem is coming from. So for that, I commend you, Kamran. I thought that was very effective, and hopefully that will prove a way to get to the bottom of this. But the thought that occurred to me was the term defining the word terrorism, right? If we want to say Oklahoma City and Tim McVeigh, was that terrorism or not? It seems to me, and I'm looking for your comments on this, that terrorism is defined by both an act and some ideology behind it. And so, the act is the same in both cases of Oklahoma and in Twin Towers. But the ideology is different. And there's some legitimacy that is given to Islam because it is the religion of over 1.5 billion people. Whereas where you have white supremacists or anti-government anarchists, there isn't a certain level of legitimacy there. And so it seems like because of that lack of legitimacy, you don't call it terrorism because the ideology isn't really given much consideration. Now, I'm just talking about the ideology right now. Of course, Islam doesn't teach that killing
I
people.
understand, but I don't know how that distinction is important
Maybe it's not.
Linguistically. I mean, if there is a group and it is a terrorist group because of its acts and ideology, whether it's made out of 20 people or 200 or more, it's a terrorist organization, and we should not be worried about labeling it as such. What are your thoughts about this?
I want to provide a thought relating to that question and the last series of questions. I think that Manar explained it very well, that the media conception and the messages we get there really have a lot to do with how we conceptualize it. Even some of the things Manar pointed out, I feel like it's my job to be aware of some of these influences that we may be getting through the media. And even I didn't think of some of the ways that you put it. It was very enlightening. So I certainly think that comes into play. And then what I like about Manar's examples, and I've seen some other people do this also visually through blogs and through other technology, social media, is to just show what the shortcomings are of that, because we can give a long lecture about it or give an analysis. And I commend people who are willing to engage in discussion in that way, like everyone here and watching online. But sometimes people want a shorter snippet, and just something comes to mind of post the Oak Creek tragedy, when the Chicago Tribune paper published something that was problematic in the way that it depicted Sikhs as well as Muslims and other community members. It was really a blogger comparing that problematic discussion about it to the way that our country described Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans some decades ago. And it was that image, I wish I could show it for you, I'm not doing justice to the visual, but it was that image that resonated with more, not just South Asian and Muslim, but other community members at large. It resonated with elected officials who started to see, okay, this is why we need to speak out against media labeling and distortion of facts. And it mobilized more people than would have been mobilized if Sapri published a long report or testimony about the issue. And so I am sorry if I'm not answering your question directly, but it just comes to mind. And that's why I like having young people involved and other creative thinkers and artists involved with this collective movement, because there are ways that we may be able to depict it that are more creative and hopefully effective than our traditional models of trying to debunk myths or talk about terminology. And just on that note, really quickly, I wanted to thank our young student volunteers for being here today and helping make this event happen. Mahima and Dave, thank you so much for all of your help.
Yeah, so the only other thing that I would add to that is that I think we're throwing around the term ideology and not thinking about how it's perceived. Like, ideology seems in this instant to be defined as religion. And I might be Muslim and you might be Muslim, but our ideologies might be very different. Our belief systems might be very different. And I think what happens with Islam is that it becomes the ideology of Islam. There's no one ideology. Everybody is a little bit, if not a lot, different. And so I think the reason that I think when it's a Muslim, the ideology is, that term is not used. The term Muslim is used. The term Islam is used. And when it's somebody from a different religion or ethnicity or whatever it is, then we start using the word ideology. And I think that in and of itself is very problematic.
So how would you define ideology?
Well, false consciousness in my book.
I think that's very personal. I think religion is very personal. I think belief systems are very personal. So I think when we're looking, if somebody is looking at an act of terrorism that occurred, right, we're looking at that individual and what their thought process is. It's not about defining a religion, ethnicity, or like, instead of searching for buckets or like boxes really to put it in, we should be looking at the individual.
And that's what I was suggesting.
I thought it was implied that it meant terrorism or extremist ideologies.
I mean, it's really interesting the way the questions here are drifting. It's, I appreciate what Kamran spoke about as a way to bring our attention to how to build resistance to this kind of treatment, and not to blame the victim and justify it. That doesn't work. And I will tell you one of the consequences of accepting this kind of treatment. We're being squeezed from the top and from the bottom. You mentioned the top. Muslims, it's very hard for us now to get into higher positions. And just remember the campaigns and whether President Obama was a Muslim. And my comment is, so if he is, doesn't the Constitution protect that right? But it became like it's a defect he might have. That reflects a certain view of Islam that the rest of the electing population is going to listen to, and if they don't have critical consciousness, they're going to be like sponges. They're going to take it in. Oh, wow, he might be a Muslim. Wow, Muslims, are bad? It's a world religion. We're also being squeezed from the bottom in the sense that our children, with their bullying, because of the kind of situation, the stereotype of Islam, the bullying of the children is causing them to become depressed, causing them to become less of achievers than their parents. They're not going to be necessarily the doctors and lawyers their parents are. Some of them are just dropping out of school because of the mistreatment through bullying, etc., due to their religion and so on. And so what are we doing to the Muslim community? Many of you immigrants came here and were doctors and businessmen and engineers, and you have some of the highest incomes in this country and the highest level of education. What about your children? If we accept this and do not try to stand up for who we are and for ourselves, your children are not going to do very well, and your move upwards is going to be stunted. Yes, ma'am.
I have some questions online. So, thank you, first of all. I was remiss in thanking our co-sponsors for the event today. I was thinking that I should do that, and I forgot. So thank you, and thank you to our volunteers as well. Some of our co-sponsors are online and watching, and there are many. So I'm going to quickly ask 3 questions. So if you want to, they're all different, and then I will pass over the mic. The first question is this. This is via Facebook. There are several events that occur at any time a bombing or killing or incident that is labeled as a Muslim or Arab issue. We are silently praying that it is not one of us. We are hoping. This is psychologically hurtful, and we don't want to have that thought going through our minds. However, that is not only where the thoughts end. It leads to bullying in schools. It leads to internal fighting in our organizations and our communities. How do we protect our children and have a proactive approach to schools to ensure that we have a place that young Arab and Muslim children are not hurt but protected? Is there any program that is being developed that we can take advantage of? That is the first question. The second question is this.
Answer them one by one? It might be better.
Okay, that's fine.
Who would like to answer this?
I feel like a mic hog, but I will.
Go ahead.
So I think the bulk of the question there is about the bullying piece as a repercussion, and I think there's a couple of things. Like, there are schools that have kind of trainings with their guidance counselors. You can check in with your schools about that. We also have a curriculum online around bullying and around addressing it and what people's rights are within the school system. I know there are several other curriculums online as well. I'm happy to connect people to them if that's helpful. I think KARAMAH might have similar things.
Maybe you can connect the questioner with Ms. Wahid on Facebook.
Absolutely.
I just want to chime in and mention something. This is a related idea of having a support network for young people in our community. And there is a program that is brand new here in Chicago called Chicago Desi Youth Rising, that it has a summer program happening in August of this year, and they're partway through their application cycle. So this is actually the time for young people who are interested in being part of that program that specifically will talk about bullying based on, again, real or perceived race, religion, sexual identity and orientation, many different factors, and in the hopes of building an inclusive and supportive environment and empowering young individuals this happens to be in the South Asian community, to have stronger skills to figure out how to react in the face of some of those difficult experiences, and who are some resources that they can take advantage of. And so that's something that I want to mention that's Chicago specific, and happy to provide more information. Sapri is really excited that this youth program is now around and here.
Okay, the second question is this. Law enforcement is another issue. Manar mentioned this in her remarks. Many of us are very hesitant, especially immigrant families, to engage with the police. We don't know that we have rights and we can file complaints against police officers. How do we engage our community in knowing about their rights to do so?
That's the legal consciousness we've been talking about, if you'd like to. And Kamran could address that too. Do you want to start?
Well, Manar, you have some thoughts already.
No,
Go ahead.
I think I've had the mic enough. It's okay.
You can follow up.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so if the question is, how do we encourage people to go to law enforcement when they are victims of crimes, I think that in our community, we need to build up some resilience and some strength. And I'm not sure, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm not sure how to do it, but our community, we need to teach our community how to be stronger. And we need to provide our community with resources, with information about how to do that. We need to ingrain the belief in our community that we have a zero tolerance standard for any kind of abuse, whether it's bullying in school or any kind of abuse. I think we need to support each other psychologically. When we turn to our friends, we want friends saying to friends, instead of saying, oh, don't rock the boat, it'll be okay, let it go this time, let's see what happens. We need to be there for each other. We need to encourage each other to take strong stances. If somebody is abused at school, I would say several parents need to go, not just the parents of the child who's being mistreated, but the authorities need to see that this is a whole community rising up against this kind of abuse. And if it's something else, if somebody is mistreated, some other kind of crime, they shouldn't have to go through this alone. So it's great to have organizations that people can turn to, but also neighbors. We have to take care of each other.
I want to chime in too about that. One of the issues that we're seeing in the Chicago South Asian community, and of course, as I had said before, the South Asian community is diverse in terms of religion, and the Muslim community is diverse in terms of race and many other factors. So I know we're not talking about one and the same thing. But we have seen from data that there have been rising numbers of South Asian workers and even business owners in Chicago who have been facing violence in the workplace and who have not felt comfortable reaching out to law enforcement or working hand in hand with whether it's law enforcement or public health authorities or others to try to prevent this violence. And so one of the things that we're realizing at SAPRI is that we actually don't, part of the answer is we don't know. We don't know the recommended follow-up to suggest to this rising number of people who are facing the issue of workplace violence. We don't know exactly why the trust is breaking down between individuals in this position, such as people who work at convenience stores and gas stations, and then the law enforcement or other people who may be able to help them. And so we're actually taking a step back, and this summer we are starting a research program in partnership with the Center for Disease Control to look at this issue, to create a safe space for discussion among people who are most directly affected by the violence, to just say, we think we have some suspicions about what may be going on, why people may be uncomfortable, and maybe what we want to recommend to them in terms of safety or public health interventions. But we also acknowledge that we don't really exactly know what's going on, because we need to hear more from the perspectives of people who are directly affected, since we're a little bit removed from that in the work that we do. So that's another opportunity for people who are based here locally and interested in helping with that workplace violence prevention research. Some of the students in this room have been interested and will be getting involved too. And we welcome anyone to help us as we roll out that research project this summer, because part of SAPRI's approach and as we go about our work is that we have ideas about how to improve some of these really tough situations and how to improve our relationships with law enforcement and other people in positions of power. But we also acknowledge that we don't have it all completely figured out. So we're trying to take a step back and really think about and analyze the problem.
So I'll agree with some of what was said about kind of raising the consciousness. Like, some of this is about talking about it and sharing stories, because the more that one of us shares a story, the more that others will talk about it. Because when people feel like they're the only one experiencing something, it just, nobody talks about it, and then there's no consciousness of it. So I think that's one piece of it. And I think sometimes we think about like these things being structured in something like this, like a town hall, but they're not. They're like everyday conversations too that raise the issue and make all of us more aware of them, so that we can kind of help each other through them. And part of that is learning about who the groups are and I don't know where this person is writing from, but in the community that you're working in or you're living in, right? So like, whether we're talking about SAPRI, whether we're talking about the ACLU, whether we're talking about, whatever organizations out there that are doing, there are so many organizations doing know your rights trainings for communities around like what your rights are with law enforcement. In most places, every time you make a 911 phone call, you are entitled to to file a complaint, to fill out to get a report. Sorry, complaint's the wrong word, but to get a report. And most people don't know that, right? So like, what are the things that we're entitled to? And if we're afraid to engage with law enforcement, what can we do that's going to help us feel less afraid? So does that mean that I get an advocate from an organization to go with me to do my police report? Because I used to do domestic violence work, and I did that all the time. And sometimes it took 4 hours sitting in the precinct. But you'll get, when I know what my client is entitled to, I will make sure they get it. So it's about connecting with the right person who knows what those are. And we can't figure out who the right organizations are and who the right advocates are without talking about the issue and sharing information.
Yeah, if our groups are doing our jobs well, we would be speaking to individuals, even if we are not the right final destination to provide someone with the exact answer. There's so much behind the scenes work that goes on to try to connect a person with the solution that would fit the best for them, whether it's referring. So at SAPRI, we have to do this frequently. We're not the expert on everything. We're not going to be the solution to everything. So we would have to refer people to CARE Chicago, to actually MALDEF, Latino civil rights organizations. There may be, really creative solutions that individually we may not have thought about, but if we brainstorm together, really a lot can be achieved. Sure.
So maybe one of the things we could do is on our website, we could put contact information to various organizations if it is not already there.
Absolutely.
And maybe we should consider online classes about knowing your rights. You have mentioned that they're everywhere, but that means people, housewives, working people have to leave their jobs to go to it. But if we have it online at a certain hour, maybe
So
people
I
can.
think
There's also like pamphlets online too.
Yeah.
So it's about figuring out which ones apply to your local jurisdiction.
So I think accessibility is also a piece of this conversation that needs to be raised, and I'm going to loop that into this next question. So I think part of the issue that we have in our communities is that there are language access issues. There are issues of not there may be many organizations that are around that are doing the work, but unfortunately, because of circumstances in our communities, isolation, et cetera, we don't have a lot of community engagement. And so the resources are not available to the people. So last night, this next question reminds me of a conversation I was having last night where a story was shared. So a part of this town hall is to share stories. And incidentally, it's hard to share these stories. I know that it's hard to share these stories. People often feel as a piece of that isolation of not talking about these very traumatic events that happened to them. But a young woman was telling me a story about a Muslim woman who was Muslim. She was visibly Muslim. This was about 4 years ago. And she was stopped in O'Hare Airport and detained in a room alone for questioning while she was traveling. And she was assaulted by a male TSA agent who came in to question her and search her. From then, there have been many issues that this woman has been facing, both psychologically and personally. And it brings me to my next question, which is, can you please talk about the connection between something like hate violence or police brutality or violations by TSA agents in airports and profiling?
Who would like to start? I want to leave you till the end to wrap it up. You get started over there.
I think that abuse by government officials can flow from profiling because profiling creates or reinforces the idea that the group being profiled is a threat, is an enemy. And so those who initially establish the profile may think in their own minds, for reasons we've discussed, that that profiling is legitimate, but then that profiling can take on a life of its own. And as far as the people who are actually implementing the profiling, for example, the TSA officer involved in that assault, then perhaps in his mind, the information that he's getting regarding the profile causes him in his mind to dehumanize the people that he's profiling. It makes it easier to abuse those people.
So how do we handle it?
I think Ami has the answer to that question.
Okay.
I wish that I did, but I did want to mention, and I think the question makes a lot of sense. And I know when we're talking about some of these issues, I don't want us to get caught too much in the lingo, and I don't want myself to get caught too much in the lingo that we forget about just the more human issue and experience of what's going on here. So one answer to the question is that I think the causes are related of police brutality, profiling, surveillance, other practices like that, and partly related to underlying misconceptions about who the individual is or who the group is, or whether even you can label that in some kind of overarching way. As you know, Manar gave us some great things to think about in terms of, can we even really make certain conclusions about someone based on their religion or race that may not even make any sense. And then I also think that the impact is something to consider, the impact of both practices of police brutality, profiling, and other problematic practices. So one thing that comes to mind for us in our work is that we have to explain to government officials, we're here to try to work. I mean, yes, I'm a lawyer, but ultimately our community may be better served if we're working cooperatively and effectively with people in power, with agencies in power. And this is sometimes not possible to do in a diplomatic way or in a cooperative way, but to try to achieve solutions in partnership with government. And sometimes it comes up where we have to explain to government officials what may seem like a very simple point to people in this room, that it's not, these practices are not just about offending someone who's from a minority group. It's not about, we're not complaining about it because we care about political correctness, to be frank. That's not where our concern is coming from. We think that the safety and security of our communities, as well as the public at large is really threatened when practices like profiling and police brutality and surveillance are allowed to continue in an improper manner. And I'll turn it over to Manar because I know she's been able to really explain that these practices are harmful actually for society at large, even though it may seem like it's just about the immediate effects on one of our own community members.
So I think we have to, and I'm going to go back to like something that I kind of said before, but think about like what the repercussions are of seeing things like this, right? So when we have like all of society seeing particular people based on what they look like getting pulled aside in airport security, and when we have particular people, like we have the NYPD surveillance stuff all over the news, and there's no DOJ investigation. And there has been a demand, like well over 100 groups have asked for it. Like there's no repercussions for that. And what does that mean for the way that we say that Muslims deserve to be treated, or any person of color for that matter? Like what are we saying about the very roots of what our country is supposed to be founded upon? What are we saying about the Constitution, civil rights, equality, all of these things when we're saying that's okay, we're not going to do anything about it? And I don't mean we in this room, I mean we like as Americans. And then when we're looking at how like all of those policies, they seep into our mentality when you see them all the time. So when you see particular people being treated differently all the time, that's kind of your instinctive response after a while when you see that person. And they've seen that in studies. When we think about like stereotyping people or who we're afraid of, like in like group studies and case studies where they do those like, they do like a, what are they called? When they have like a small group of people and they do these studies to see what their reactions are. Focus groups, thank you. But how that kind of like perpetuates, and I just want to give like a more specific example, because I talked about how like these policies of profiling and like the xenophobic rhetoric from like people that we view as high level people in our society, how those impact our society, how we treat each other, how we treat certain people, what the media says, what government officials say. And a couple years ago here, shortly after Oak Creek, and Ami might be able to speak to this more specifically, Joe Walsh was a member of Congress here, and he made several anti-Muslim statements. And within just a number of weeks, like I think it was less than 2 weeks, there were like 4 incidents of hate violence in the Muslim community. I want to say they were all against religious institutions, but just like that, right? And I'm not saying that was the cause, but I'm saying it creates a climate that makes that okay because there's no accountability for it, and that impacts all of us.
And with an election coming up, this is an election year, and you know we, as other groups in the room, are also nonpartisan organizations, so not saying who to vote for or who to vote against, but it's really important that all of our communities get educated on the issues and the candidates and what they stand for, and donors in some cases. It's important to look beyond the surface. That happened when a congressman was already in office and running for re-election, and the very diverse community members of that district let their opinions on that and other social issues be known when they went to the polls shortly after those incidents. And it's important for us to continue to be vigilant when we have not just the elections, but the voter registration that happens before, the language access that happens before. All of that fits together in terms of empowering our community members to hold the elected officials and the candidates responsible.
Yes, please. Microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. First, I want to thank all of you for this discussion. It's been very enriching for me. My name is Amara Enya. I have just a question about this notion of bridge building. And so I'll use myself or my own perspective as an example. So the question is, how do we build bridges across difference and work collaboratively, because this issue impacts across racial lines, across ethnic lines, across geography, across communities. And so, for example, we have, for me personally as a Nigerian American from a country that's roughly half Muslim, half Nigerian, how do we have this kind of conversation within that context to say that we don't demonize half of our population because of, for example, we had 200-something girls kidnapped a few months ago. So how do we have that conversation internally? The second perspective for me is, from a community standpoint, working in the city of Chicago, I'm working in predominantly African American communities who also have business owners that are Muslim. And so how do we get them to build bridges so that they can understand that this is actually, that a lot of the challenges that we face are shared challenges, and to not see these, for example, the business owners as the other or as a part of an oppressive structure, to see that bigger picture that we're all living in a system that tends to demonize others. And whether you're black, whether you're Muslim, whether you're a woman, we all are living that experience. So how do we, or how do you, what's your recommendation to begin to build those bridges so that we can have these collective, collaborative conversations and really fight back against something that's a lot bigger than any individual group?
I would like to address the Nigerian part of the question and allow the rest to answer the rest of the question. The reason for that is because I've studied a little bit Nigeria when I was on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. And so I looked at some expert views, and what I'm finding out in the case of Nigeria is a couple of things I will mention. I don't want to go too deeply with it because this is not the issue here, but it is instructive because what we're seeing there is also selective reporting. Yes, there have been problems of where the Muslim groups have basically victimized Christian groups in their own areas, but nobody is reporting what's happening in the Christian groups vis-a-vis the victimization of Muslims. So that's selective reporting that nobody here is aware of unless they decide to go and look into it. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, by the way, the international, I should mention one more thing about the Boko Haram people. KARAMAH just issued an alert on the behavior of the Boko Haram on the religious side as opposed to the women's side, which we always deal with. I suggest that you go to our website and read about it. But also Carnegie issued a study, a very interesting study, as to what really makes Boko Haram tick. Is it Islam? Or is it geopolitical considerations? And that's a point I want to bring to the rest of you, because many Muslims feel like they have to crawl into a corner every time there is an international incident involving Muslim countries or Muslims, as if, we have to carry the burden of that. What happens overseas, and there are geopolitical issues that, are behind it. And that's not what we're talking about. I'm very pleased that today all our discussion was about Chicago, Washington, New York, whatever, because we're American citizens and that's what we're talking about, okay? But I just wanted to mention that when we hear sometimes about foreign affairs, so to speak, again, we have selective reporting which creates a certain kind of perception. Please go ahead and answer her other question.
Very important questions, and I know you mentioned some of the work that needs to be done in terms of residents of some neighborhoods better understanding people who work there, and the issue is both ways. So one of the reasons we're really interested, and just as one example, this workplace violence prevention research, is because we've heard from some of our South Asian business owners and employees who have been facing this rising violence that we know it's not just us in the south and west side of Chicago who are facing violence. It's a broader issue. And so let's talk about it in a way that can look towards results that will help everyone. And we've also heard some frank feedback from South Asian business owners that maybe there can be more done to reinvest in these communities. So some of these areas that have the high rate of violence against South Asians may not be areas where a lot of South Asians are living, and it may be more so working and having businesses there. So again, I don't pretend to offer an overly simplistic solution, but I think the discussions need to be broad like that. So when the Center for Disease Control approached us about this public health research, we said, yes, we're absolutely interested, but it needs to be part of a broader discussion about how different groups are getting along or not knowing about each other, even though we're living and working so closely together. And we are stepping back a bit, as I described it, because we think that it's really important to do some research and discussion, very honest, anonymous, confidential discussion with our community members who are most directly facing this problem. So we're not making too many assumptions about what are the dynamics going on there. But then following that research, we're actually very much planning and so excited to have a broader community dialogue about the results and say, these are the preliminary results. Does this reflect what people are experiencing in these neighborhoods? How is it short-sighted? So we can keep that in mind for future work that would actually do something with the research to hopefully implement it into policy and advocacy that can help our collective communities. So I just described this as one example to show you our blueprint for what we think needs to happen to tackle some of these complex issues like violence. And for some other areas that are maybe farther along and more developed in terms of our community's collective advocacy, there are already stronger coalitions and even legislative initiatives that people are working on together. We just learned on Friday that the initiative of same-day voter registration passed in the Illinois House and Senate, which will expand all of our communities of color's ability to be more engaged in the voting process among people who are citizens and eligible to vote. And so, and that was definitely an effort achieved by a vibrant coalition of people from different racial backgrounds and different neighborhoods of Chicago and of the whole state. So not all of our work on social issues is maybe advanced to that level of having this cross-racial campaign in an organized manner with a website and ways to sign on and a political strategy. But hopefully that will provide us some inspiration and ideas about how to move forward on some of the other issues.
You asked about how to bring people together, how to encourage people to find common ground. So I'd like to tell you how we try to do that at Muslims for a Safe America. Now, obviously, we only deal with a certain set of issues, but I think that what we do is applicable in any area. And what we do that I think is somewhat unique is that we challenge people. Often when people get together, they get together with people who think like them. I mean, it's, preaching to the choir. What we do is we intentionally make sure that when there's a discussion, both sides or all three sides or whatever are presented. And so we present our audience with the strongest arguments on each side of the issue. So for example, when we do an event on profiling, we present the strongest arguments against profiling and the strongest arguments in favor of profiling. And what that does is it gives people a baseline of knowledge about the issue, and then it encourages them to think critically and to take positions based on information and discussion rather than emotion. And I think that this is applicable in any area. If you have a conflict between two groups, they need to be brought together, two groups that seem to have differing interests. They need to really listen to each other, and someone needs to provide a forum where they can have an open and honest discussion and hash issues out. When we have done this, when we have challenged people, we have gotten great feedback because they say that they benefit from seeing the big picture, and they also benefit from forums where they can engage with each other instead of just having a speaker lecture to them and tell them, well, this is what's right and this is what's wrong.
If I could just add really quickly. So I just based on where I am and what I do, look at that in two ways. I look at it from an advocacy-based perspective and then from a personal perspective. And I think from an advocacy-based perspective, if you're coming from an organization or you're coming from a particular lens of issue areas, it's to look at the communities and the groups that are already in existence that have similarities, where you have similarities and differences. So I can tell you from experience that post 9/11, the groups that stepped up to the plate to have our backs were the Japanese American community, like the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, completely had the Muslim community's back. The NAACP has always had like the larger, broader Muslim community's back. So I think there's something to be said for understanding what the issue areas are and what the overlap is. But I also think it's really about relationship building, which is kind of what you were saying when you first started talking, because I can't just call another group when I need them. And it's also, I don't believe in tit for tat, right? It's not like you had my back today, so I'll get your back tomorrow, whatever the issue is. It's where we have similarities, and then we're going to have differences that we don't agree on with other organizations as well. And I think it's about being honest about them. And then I think from a personal perspective, I think it's really about like, I think as a society, for such a diverse nation, we're so segregated in our social lives, in the way like many neighborhoods are structured. Like we're segregated in most urban cities. And I think it's about building those relationships. Like what are the similarities we have? Where do we have like common bonds, and like building relationships, and then the rest of it comes later.
And having, just a quick point on that note, having a long-term strategy and patience too can help, because we may not achieve all of this solidarity overnight. And I know there are challenges, and when we're all trying to do that. And I just wanted to very briefly modify what I had said. So last year, online voter registration passed as a broad collective effort to expand access to the polls, especially for communities of color. On Friday, an expanded voter registration passed, but I believe it's not quite same day yet. And maybe that's something for our groups to work on in the future, because we've talked about how civic engagement really has a direct impact on what kind of discussions and viewpoints we tolerate from our elected officials, and how we can hold elected officials accountable.
Just one last, how many questions do we have now? One, did you have your hand up? Okay, so, and you have two? Okay, we'll do it quickly, but just so that I clarify, I mentioned that the Carnegie spoke about Boko Haram, and I'd like to say it was Sarah Shays who wrote an op-ed. She's from Carnegie. She wrote an op-ed in Washington Post, May 16th, on Boko Haram. It's worth reading. It's a good statement. Go ahead, please.
I actually think that was a great question to end with, and I feel like I'm just bringing the conversation back to what we had first started with. But we talked a little bit about authority and how they profile Muslim Americans when it comes to terrorism. And, even just personally, I've seen informants come into religious institutions, mosques, Islamic schools, and they somehow coerce people to believe a certain ideology. It seems like they even profile people that are very vulnerable in order to do this coercion. And to me, it just seems very unethical. And I guess I want to know what our rights are as Muslim Americans in order to prevent such coercion going on in our institutions. I don't know. I'm sorry.
I think you're talking about sting operations, right? Or entrapment? Is that what you're
entrapment. So informants going in and like befriending people, and then even to the point that they coerce them to think a certain way. Or maybe coerce is a little bit too much a powerful word. Yes, I apologize.
Because they don't know their rights.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think what you mean is that somebody, either a undercover agent or an informant, meets a Muslim and then starts trying to incite them and say, hey, don't you think we need to do something to attack the United States? And as far as I know, in every single case since 9/11 where a Muslim has raised an entrapment defense after being charged with plotting an attack, that defense has failed. And those people have all been convicted. So anything that's going to be done to protect those people from being incited has to be done ahead of time. And those people need to be made aware that agents may come to you and try and incite you to take some action, and you should be aware that they may be government agents.
Manar?
So I would say,
answer this from a Muslim organization's perspective.
Quickly, because we have two more questions.
It's not a question, it's a comment to your question. I've been involved with Muslim organizations where we have very specific policy against inciting any violent act against the U.S. or anywhere else. And anecdotally, we have seen it's somewhat hilarious at times how obvious these examples are. Typically, it's a white male who pretends or is a convert, a recent convert, who's trying to incite local Muslims. If it's an immigrant mosque, if it's a mosque in the Hispanic or predominantly African American community, then it's typically a black male. And most Muslim organizations are aware of it, and we typically chase them out of the mosque.
Still,
So-
some
so-
vulnerable people fall for it. And how do we identify these people and warn them? I don't know. I think there should simply
we
be.
talk about it at the
I think
institutional level.
There should be what I've talked about in the very beginning, a legal consciousness for everybody about what's right and wrong in this country, right? And what you may do and what you may not do. And if you feel you're being coerced or blackmailed into doing something against your beliefs or your interests, then come to somebody in your community or in a light community and talk to them, and they will advise you. Manar, what do you think?
No, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, I think part of the problem is we have to remember, too, that with some of these entrapment cases, what is allowed to actually be revealed in court is not the full conversation. So whatever small statements the person that is being entrapped is saying are taken out of context. And so I think what we have to remember as a community is, unfortunately, that, like, we're being watched. We know that. That's factual at this point. So I think often we engage, or often I've seen people engage in a way that's not, it's like appeasement in the conversation, right? They're like trying to get out of the conversation, or they think maybe the person has mental health issues. And I think we have to approach it from like a more defensive, proactive place and not engage in those conversations, because there are repercussions that in the court system are beyond our control because of what pieces of the conversation will be revealed through the court proceeding.
What would you say? Give them a line that they could say if somebody approaches them.
I mean, I would just exit the conversation. I would have a phone call. I just don't think it's a productive conversation to engage in. It's not, and it's.
Yeah. We also have to keep in mind that there are people in our community who are open to this kind of thought. And we need to think as a community about what we can do about people who are thinking along these lines. It's a bigger issue.
If we only know who these people are, and really it is a matter, if there are people who think that this kind of behavior is going to change things for Muslims in the US, okay, then they have a very simplistic thought process. And I think the answer to that is to educate them and make them think clearly about how in this country you affect change. Many of these people, remember, came from countries that did not have democracies. Countries where they had a group of people firmly in control. You couldn't throw them off without doing something violent, right? This is not this country, and that's what we have to teach them. I mean, I think that's part of the issue.
I think also just for the perspective of how we're dealing with this situation and the kind of engagement that is coming from whether it's the FBI or law enforcement is. There was somebody in the NYPD who's, this whole NYPD surveillance thing, the statement by this officer was, we're going to catch them before they even know that they're terrorists. What do you do with that? Like, you're going to know before they know. Like, you're pushing them into this route in some way, right? Like, how do you know before they know? That in and of itself is like a total oxymoron, and that's what we're dealing with.
So we need to really have red flags all over the place so that nobody pushes you
Have
into
a lovely
something.
day.
Because you don't want to be pushed into something you didn't mean to be into. You have two
I
questions
have
quickly.
two questions very quickly. One is a very specific question, so it's short, and the other one is a good one to end on. So the first is for Ms. Gandhi. The question, and I'm going to go ahead and say both so that we can wrap this up. Is there anything being done locally to address the very biased reporting in Chicago newspapers, such as the Chicago Tribune? That's the first very specific question. And then the larger question is this. and this is towards Dr. El-Hibri and others, has there been any research on the law of interpretation of the legality of profiling and probable cause, and also for its enforceability? And what I mean by that is that profiling is not just a religious issue, it is a ethnic and racial issue. And it happens in our communities that are mixed when folks who are perceived to have not been in the right place, so they're not in the right neighborhoods. What happens with the outliers of that community if they're not supposed to be where they are? So if they're stopped and they're not supposed to be where they are. And hold on one second.
Well, shall we
So
stop
this
here?
becomes an issue. So that's the issue. So
Let's
this
stop.
becomes an issue of the suburban community versus when it happens to the suburban communities, when those communities are affected, people want to rise and take action, and what's happening in inner cities, for example.
Okay.
I'm not aware of a widespread effort, broad effort to tackle bias in reporting. If I am ignorant in saying that, then someone please teach me and Sapri about a broader campaign going on. I do know that there have been some more individualized actions and activism, like a few that I mentioned today about particularly problematic isolated coverage by Sun-Times or by Tribune. And then we also may want to think very creatively if there's an interest in having more of a campaign, and by campaign I just mean like a broad-based advocacy effort by diverse coalition partners around this. It may be beyond a Muslim or South Asian issue. It may be beyond issues of reporting on race and religion. We may actually want to take a look at, just like I talked about, looking at the role of money in politics and donors. We also maybe need to take a look at money in media and other influences and biases involved in media. And there are groups like Common Cause Illinois and others who look at that. So we may want to think broadly. If it sounds like the person who asked the question may have a particular issue relating to bias that they're noticing. So we should continue the conversation and think really broadly and strategically about how to approach something like that with institutions as powerful as Chicago Tribune.
Yeah, on the second question, I think it's a little bit of a narrow definition of when profiling takes place, when you are outside your neighborhood or outside your group. Because how would you define profiling on the airplane? So is that like a non-Muslim neighborhood where Muslims shouldn't be, or white neighborhood where blacks shouldn't be, or what? I think the definition in itself is a little bit problematic, but I will let others answer it as it stands.
I mean, I think in terms of addressing the issue and raising the issue, it comes back to so somebody in a more suburban area, which is typically going to be like a black person in a white neighborhood, or potentially like a hijabi in a white neighborhood where people don't want them or feel threatened by them. That's going to get reported, and there's going to be like a quick response by law enforcement, right? But I think that's something we have to raise the profile of these issues, right? Because as long as we're letting them kind of pass under the radar, they're non-issues. The NYPD surveillance was a non-issue. The Chicago police brutality incident, if there hadn't been a camera that caught that, it would not exist unless the media picked it up. So I think it goes back to how can we shape media? How can we shape those dialogues? And I think that goes back to sharing our stories, whether we're sharing them with the KARAMAH, whether we're sharing them in local newsletters and local forums, and writing pieces, writing op-eds. We have to raise the profile of those things. And I hate that the responsibility is on us for a lot of this, and I don't think that we have to offer an explanation for anything, but I feel like the only way to fight injustice is to make it known.
I think that's a great note to finish our town hall meeting on. I would like to say that at this meeting, I hope you agree with me, we raised a lot of important questions. We developed a great deal of food for thought, thanks to our three distinguished panelists here. I'd like you to go home and think some more about this, and maybe think about possible ways of looking at this we didn't talk about, possible issues. Feel free to write us again at KARAMAH. This is an ongoing conversation. We will have another town hall meeting in another city, and we really need for the community to develop its thought, and its needs as well. What do you think will help you further, and talk to us about it. We've gone over, but your questions have been extremely important and interesting, both in present and online. Thank you all very much, and we will continue to be on touch.